The first bullet snapped the branch beside Sergeant Eva Rostova's head, a sharp final crack that severed the tense silence of the pine forest. The splinters of wood seemed to hang in the air for a moment, a suspended prelude to the chaos that erupted an instant later. From the ridge above, muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers in the fading afternoon light. Then the sound reached them, a rolling wave of thunder that hammered against their ears. "Contact front!" someone yelled, their voice tight and high with adrenaline. Eva was already moving, her body acting on a deep-seated instinct drilled into her over a decade of service. "Perimeter, now!" she barked, her own voice a controlled blade of sound cutting through the panic. She shoved Private Miller towards a thick pine, his young face a mask of stunned disbelief. "Miller, suppress that ridge." "Jenkins, watch our 6. They're behind us, too." The dreaded call came over the squad radio, confirming her worst fear. "Contact rear!" They were surrounded. The enemy had chosen their ground perfectly, a low basin surrounded by higher ground, a perfect kill zone. The air sizzled with incoming fire, rounds chewing up the dirt and bark around them. Eva keyed the mic on her shoulder, her fingers steady, a stark contrast to the frantic beating of her heart. "Eagle Actual, this is Badger 1. We are pinned down, grid Lima 9 or 3. Request immediate fire support, over." Static hissed back at her, a hollow, empty sound. She tried again, her voice more insistent. "Eagle Actual, this is Badger 1. Do you copy? We are in heavy contact and surrounded, over." More static. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. They were jamming the frequency. No comms, no air support, no quick reaction force. They were utterly, completely on their own. She scanned her squad, her family. 11 faces looked back at her, some set in grim determination, others pale with a fear they couldn't hide. Corporal Davis, the reliable point man, was already returning fire in controlled bursts. Jenkins, the veteran sniper, was a statue of calm, his eye pressed to his scope, searching for a target. But she saw the tremor in Private Miller's hands as he fumbled to reload, and the wide, terrified eyes of their medic, Doc Riley. They were looking to her, their sergeant. The daughter of a man whose tactical genius was the stuff of legend. The weight of that legacy, of their 12 lives, settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had to think. She had to be the officer her father had raised her to be, not through formal training, but through a childhood of maps and riddles and stories of survival from a different war. The enemy fire intensified, probing their makeshift perimeter. They were being methodically bracketed. Soon the mortars would start. And after that, the final assault. They couldn't stay here. Staying was death, or a fate worse than death in some enemy prison camp. They had to move. But where? Every direction seemed to hold a waiting gun. Eva Rostova took a slow, deep breath, forcing the ice into her veins, and made a choice. They would not die here. She would find a way. She would lead them home. The static from the radio was a death sentence. Eva ripped the headset away, the hollow hiss echoing the void opening in her gut. They were cut off. Truly alone. "Comms are jammed," she yelled over the gunfire. "They've got us in a box!" Panic, a living, breathing thing, threatened to choke the air from her lungs. She saw it reflected in the eyes of her squad, a raw animal fear that could shatter their discipline in a heartbeat. Then a memory flashed unbidden. Her father's study, the smell of old books and polish. She was 10 years old, and he was pointing to a vast topographic map pinned to the wall. "The map is not the territory, Yevgenia," he said, using her proper name, his voice grave. "The enemy reads the same maps. Your advantage lies not in knowing the path, but in creating one where they see none." The lesson, a relic from his Cold War service, snapped her back to the present. The fear receded, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She was Sergeant Eva Rostova, and she would not let her squad die in this damned forest. "Davis! Miller! Lay down suppressing fire on that ridge! Make them keep their heads down!" "Jenkins, you see that fallen oak at 10 o'clock? I need you to get there and be my eyes. Tell me what they're doing, not just where they are." Her orders were crisp, precise, cutting through the chaos. She crawled on her belly, the damp earth soaking into her uniform until she reached Corporal Davis. He was firing methodically, his jaw clenched. "How are we looking, Sergeant?" He grunted, not taking his eye from his sight. "We're moving, Corporal," she said, her voice low. "As soon as it's dark." His eyes flickered to hers, a question in them. "Where to?" "They have us flanked." Eva pulled a small laminated map from her chest pocket. It was creased and worn. She pointed not to a trail or a road, but to a vast, blank expanse of green marked only with topographical lines squeezed tightly together. "Here," she said. Davis stared. "That's impassable terrain. Thorns, ravines, no cover." "Exactly," Eva replied, a grim smile touching her lips. "They won't expect it. They'll watch the trails, the easy routes. They think we'll break for the exfil point in a straight line. We won't. We're going to disappear." She moved again, this time to where Private Miller was firing wildly, his shots going high and wide. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder, making him jump. "Breathe, Miller," she commanded, her voice calm but firm. "You're wasting ammo. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Aim, breathe, squeeze." She stayed with him for a moment, a steadying presence, until his breathing slowed and his shots became more controlled. "Doc," she called to the medic, "when we move, Davis has a leg wound." "You're with him. I need you to keep him on his feet." Doc Riley gave a tight nod, his face pale but determined. The trust in their eyes was a heavier weight than any enemy fire. They believed she could do this. They believed she could weave a miracle from thorns and shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into an inky, premature darkness, Eva prepared them. "We move in 5. Dump anything that makes noise. Canteens, loose gear, secure it all. We are ghosts from this moment on. Absolute silence." She looked at their faces, illuminated now only by the sporadic muzzle flashes from the enemy positions. They were scared, but they were ready. They were waiting for her signal. She reached down to her hip and unsheathed her survival knife. The worn leather grip felt like an old friend in her hand. It was her father's knife, a piece of history he had entrusted to her. The steel blade, honed to a razor's edge, caught the faintest glimmer of the emerging moonlight. This was their way out. Not a rifle, not a grenade, but this simple, brutal tool and the will to use it. The time for defense was over. It was time to vanish. The last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the forest into a deep, oppressive darkness. It was a living blackness, broken only by the occasional distant muzzle flash that painted the trees in brief, strobing snapshots of eerie light. The enemy fire had slackened to sporadic, probing bursts. They were waiting, conserving ammunition, confident their trap was sealed. Eva could feel their patience like a physical pressure. She gave the signal, a low 2-click sound over the squad radio. It was time. They moved like shadows detaching from the night. One by one, they rose from their defensive positions and melted into a tight, single-file line behind her. The only sounds were the crunch of a carefully placed boot, the rustle of fabric against foliage, and the ragged rhythm of their breathing. Eva led them away from the basin, not towards the expected routes, but directly into the heart of the thickest, most tangled part of the forest. The air grew colder. The canopy above was so dense it blotted out the stars. She relied on memory, on the mental map she had seared into her mind during those last moments of daylight. Every few yards she would stop, holding up a clenched fist, the squad freezing instantly behind her. She would listen, her entire being focused on the night sounds, filtering out the familiar for the threat of a snapped twig or a whispered command that wasn't theirs. After 20 minutes of painstaking progress, a disaster struck. Corporal Davis, leaning heavily on Doc Riley, stumbled. His injured leg buckled and he fell against a deadfall branch. The crack was deafening in the silence, a gunshot of sound that seemed to echo through the trees. From the ridge behind them, a shout rang out in a foreign tongue. A moment later, a flare shot into the sky, hissing as it burst into a blinding, magnesium-white sun. The forest was drenched in a harsh, unforgiving light. They were caught, frozen in the act of escape. "Down, everyone down!" Eva hissed, pulling Davis and the medic behind a large spruce tree. The squad hit the dirt as machine gun fire raked the area where they had just been standing, chewing up the earth and sending splinters of wood flying. Tracers streaked through the darkness, brilliant green lines searching for them. The enemy knew they were on the move. The flare died, plunging them back into darkness, but the damage was done. The hunt was now active. They could hear shouts and the crashing of undergrowth as enemy fighters began to descend from the ridge, pursuing them. Panic threatened to take hold once more. Private Miller was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming! They're right on top of us!" Ava crawled to him, grabbing the strap of his body armor and pulling his face close to hers. Her eyes were like flint in the dim light. "Look at me, soldier," she whispered, her voice a low, iron command that brooked no argument. "You look at me. Breathe. In. Out." She took an exaggerated breath with him. "They are not on top of us. They are making noise because they are scared. They are in the open, and we are in the dark. We have the advantage now." She held his gaze until she saw the wild fear recede, replaced by a fragile focus. She turned to the rest of the squad, their faces pale ovals in the gloom. "We are getting out of here," she said, her voice firm, carrying to every one of them. "All of us. You have my word." It was a promise she had no right to make, a burden she placed squarely on her own shoulders. But they needed to hear it. They needed to see the absolute, unshakable conviction in her face. She was their leader, their navigator, their shield. She would carve a path through hell itself if that's what it took. The crashing in the forest grew louder. They were out of time. Ava turned, her father's knife in her hand, and faced the wall of thorns and shadows that lay ahead. "Stay close," she ordered, "and stay quiet." With a powerful, silent thrust, she drove the blade into the tangled vegetation and began to cut. The knife was an extension of her will. Each thrust and slice into the snarled wall of vines and thorny branches was a silent declaration of defiance. It was brutal, exhausting work. The thickets fought back, scratching deep red lines across her face and hands, snagging on her gear, trying to hold them prisoner. Behind her, the squad moved in a tense, silent procession, a chain of trust in the oppressive dark. The only sounds were the soft rip of vegetation, the crunch of a carefully placed footstep, and the ragged, suppressed breathing of Corporal Davis as he hobbled forward, supported by Doc Riley and Private Miller. Ava's world shrank to the few feet in front of her, illuminated by the faint green glow of her compass light. She navigated by instinct as much as by the map in her head, avoiding open patches, seeking the most difficult ground, the paths no sane person would take. The sounds of their pursuers began to fade, muffled by the dense foliage she was leading them through. It was working. They were disappearing. After an hour, the terrain began to slope sharply downward. The thickets gave way to a steep, rocky ravine, its bottom lost in blackness. It was a treacherous path, but it was a clear one, offering faster movement. For a moment, it seemed like a gift. Eva held up a fist and the squad froze. She listened, her ears straining. Nothing but the drip of moisture and the sigh of the wind in the high branches. She took a cautious step onto the first moss-slicked rock. Then Jenkins, the sniper, was at her side, his hand on her arm, stopping her. He pointed down into the ravine, then cupped his hand behind his ear. Ava strained to hear. Then she caught it. A faint metallic click, the sound of a weapon's safety being disengaged. It came from below. Jenkins pointed again, this time using hand signals. Enemy, below, ambush. A cold dread washed over her. The enemy commander was good. He hadn't just chased them. He had anticipated her. He knew she would avoid the obvious, and had sent a team to cut them off at the first piece of defensible terrain. The ravine was another kill zone. They were still in the cage, its walls had just moved. She signaled the squad to pull back, slowly, silently. They retreated into the cover of the thorns, their hope so recently kindled, flickering dangerously. They were trapped between the pursuers behind and the ambush ahead. The direct route was suicide. Ava closed her eyes, shutting out the fearful faces of her squad. She thought of her father's stories, not of battles, but of escapes, of disappearing into the earth, into the water, into thin air. Her eyes snapped open. She looked away from the ravine, away from the trails, and toward the one feature everyone avoids. A narrow, fast-flowing stream cut through the forest to their left, its banks choked with slick black rocks and thick mud. It was a miserable, energy-sapping path. It was also their only way out. "We follow the water," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It will throw off the dogs, hide our tracks, and mask our noise." There were no objections. The trust was absolute now. They slipped into the icy water, the shock of it stealing their breath. They moved with the current, their boots slipping on the rocky bed, the sound of their passage swallowed by the gurgle and splash of the stream. The water was their cloak. For the first time since the first bullet was fired, Eva allowed herself a sliver of something that felt like hope. They were not just running anymore. They were ghosts, flowing through the veins of the forest unseen and unheard. The knife was still in her hand, its blade wet not with sap, but with cold, clean water. The path was brutal, but it was theirs. The water was a knife of ice, stealing the breath from their lungs and the feeling from their legs. Every step was a battle against the current and the slick, treacherous rocks beneath the surface. Sergeant Eva Rostova led from the front, her teeth clenched to stop them from chattering, her entire being focused on maintaining her footing. One slip, one splash too loud, and it would all be for nothing. The stream was their salvation, but it was also a trial by cold and exhaustion. Behind her, the squad moved like phantoms, their dark forms barely visible in the gloom. The only sounds were the relentless gurgle of the water and the ragged, shuddering breaths they could no longer fully suppress. Corporal Davis was suffering the most. Each jolt as his injured leg dragged over a rock sent a visible spasm through his body, his face a tight mask of pain in the faint light. Doc Riley and Private Miller held him up, their own strength fading with every yard. The water soaked into his bandages, diluting the blood into pink streams that swirled away into the darkness. Eva glanced back, her heart clenching at the sight. They were running out of time, not just from the enemy, but from their own bodies giving out. They had been in the water for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 20 minutes. The cold was a creeping poison, sapping their will and their coordination. She knew they needed to get out soon, or hypothermia would claim them as surely as a bullet. She signaled a halt, raising a clenched fist. The squad froze, leaning against the muddy bank for support, their chests heaving. In the sudden silence, broken only by the stream, they listened. No crashing in the undergrowth, no shouted commands, no gunfire. The forest around them was silent. They had done it. They had lost their pursuers. The relief was so palpable she could feel it wash over the squad like a warm wave. But they weren't safe yet. They were still deep behind enemy lines, wet, cold, and leaving a trail of water wherever they went. Eva knew they needed shelter, a place to regroup and tend to Davis properly. She pointed her knife toward the bank, and they hauled themselves out of the numbing water, collapsing onto the leaf-strewn ground, shivering uncontrollably. They were in a small, secluded hollow surrounded by ancient, gnarled oaks. It was as good a place as any to make a stand, or at least to catch their breath. As Doc Riley began to cut away Davis's soaked bandages, Jenkins, ever vigilant, moved to the edge of the hollow to keep watch. Eva moved among her soldiers, checking on each one, a word of quiet encouragement here, a firm pat on the shoulder there. She stopped by Miller, who was wringing water from his sleeves, his hands shaking from cold and spent adrenaline. "You did good, Miller," she said, her voice low. "You kept your head." He looked up, a flicker of pride in his exhausted eyes. "You let us out, Sarge." It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but in that moment, huddled in that dark hollow, they allowed themselves to believe it could be. They had escaped the immediate trap. They had outthought and outendured the enemy. The trust they had in her was now a tangible thing, a bond forged in fear and cold water. Eva looked at their faces, pale and drawn, but alive with a newfound determination. They were no longer just a squad following orders. They were a unit, surviving against impossible odds. And she was their leader. The knife in her hand felt lighter now, its purpose shifting from carving a path to defending the small piece of safety they had won. The night was far from over, but for the first time, the darkness felt like an ally. The hollow offered a fragile sanctuary, a brief respite from the relentless chase. For a few precious minutes, the only sounds were the ragged breathing of the squad and the soft professional rustle of Doc Riley applying a fresh, dry bandage to Corporal Davis's leg. The corporal bit down on a leather strap, his face beaded with sweat despite the chilling cold. The grimace of pain was a stark reminder that their ordeal was far from over. Abba moved to his side, her own body aching with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "How is it, Doc?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. Doc Riley didn't look up from his work. "The bleeding's slowed, but he's lost a lot. He can't walk on this, Sarge. Not really. Not for long." Davis spat out the strap, his voice a strained whisper. "I can keep up. Just give me a stick. I'm not a burden." Ava placed a firm hand on his good shoulder. "You're not a burden, Corporal. You're one of us, and we're not leaving you." Her words were for him, but also for the rest of the squad, who were listening intently. It was a reaffirmation of the promise she had made in the heat of the ambush. All of them, home. Jenkins, a shadow against the darker trees, shifted his position. "It's quiet. Too quiet. They're not just going to give up." Ava nodded, her mind already racing ahead. The enemy knew they were on foot, injured, and cut off. They would be calculating the possible routes, setting up new ambushes at the likeliest exit points from the forest. The stream had bought them time, but it had also taken them further from their original exfil coordinates. They were adrift in a sea of hostile trees. She pulled the soaked map from her pocket, careful not to tear it. Using the dim green light of her compass, she traced their probable location. They were deep in the valley now, further than any friendly patrol would dare to venture. The direct route to safety was a straight line through miles of enemy-controlled territory. It was impossible. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a lesson from a lifetime ago. "When the direct path is a wall, Yevgenia, you do not break your head against it. You find a way under or over or through a crack they never thought to guard." She looked up from the map, her eyes scanning the worried faces around her. "They'll be waiting for us at all the obvious places," she announced, her voice gaining a new strength. "The main trails, the road crossings, the original exfil point. They think they've herded us. They think we're scared animals running for the nearest hole." She folded the map with a decisive snap. "So we're not going to any of those places." Private Miller looked confused. "Then where are we going, Sarge?" A grim, determined smile touched Eva's lips. "We're going to the one place they would never expect a wounded, exhausted squad to go. We're going to climb." She pointed toward the silhouette of a steep, rugged hillside that loomed to the north, a darker black against the night sky. "That ridge leads to the old border outposts. They're abandoned, rusted relics from my father's time. No strategic value. The enemy ignores them. But on the other side of that ridge, there's a long-range patrol route. Our people sometimes use it. It's a brutal climb, especially for Davis, but it's our crack in the wall." There was a moment of stunned silence as the squad absorbed her audacious plan. It was madness. To climb, with a wounded man, after all they had been through. But in their sergeant's eyes, they saw no doubt, only a fierce, unbreakable resolve. Jenkins was the first to speak, a low grunt of approval. "They'll never see it coming." The decision was made. There would be no more running. Now they would ascend. The climb was a fresh kind of hell, a vertical ordeal that tested the very last of their strength. The hillside was a brutal composition of loose shale, stubborn thorn bushes, and jagged outcrops of rock that tore at their already ragged uniforms. There was no path. They made their own inch by agonizing inch. Sergeant Eva Rostova led the way, her father's knife often sheathed, her bare, bleeding hands now their primary tool. She would scramble up a few feet, find a secure purchase, then reach down to help haul Corporal Davis up. Private Miller and Doc Riley formed a human chain below, pushing, pulling, supporting the wounded man from behind. Every grunt of effort, every dislodged stone that clattered down the slope, sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet night. Their world shrank to the next handhold, the next foothold. Muscles, pushed far beyond their limits, screamed in protest. Lungs burned in the thin, cold air. The darkness was both a blessing and a curse, hiding the terrifying sheer drops, but also masking the way forward. Eva navigated by feel and by the faint, unwavering glow of her compass, aiming for a notch in the ridgeline she had memorized from the map. It was a brutal, soul-grinding slog that felt like it would never end. Just when it seemed the slope would continue forever, the ground began to level out. With one final Herculean effort, Eva pulled herself and then Davis over a last rocky lip and onto a narrow, wind-swept plateau. They had reached the ridge. One by one, the rest of the squad collapsed onto the flat ground, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, too spent to even speak. For a long moment, they just lay there, gulping in the cold air, the immensity of the star-filled sky above them a stark contrast to the claustrophobic forest below. Then Jenkins, Eva the watchman crawled to the edge and looked down the other side. He went perfectly still. Eva, her heart sinking, crawled to his side. Below them, nestled in a small clearing, were the faint glowing embers of a campfire. Around it, silhouetted against the dying fire, were the figures of at least a dozen enemy soldiers. They had set up a temporary patrol base, directly blocking the path to the old border outposts. They were waiting. They had anticipated her move after all. Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to consume her. They had given everything, climbed this impossible mountain, only to find another wall. There was no way around. To go back down was to surrender. To go forward was suicide. They were trapped on a barren ridge, with dawn only an hour or two away. As if to seal their fate, a soft, electronic chirp came from Jenkins's gear. Then another from Miller's. The enemy had switched on a low-power, localized jamming field, scanning for any signals in the area. Their own radios, if they used them, would light up like a beacon, pinpointing their exact location on this exposed ridge. They were utterly, finally, out of options. Eva closed her eyes, the weight of her failure pressing down on her. She had led them this far only to deliver them to their end. She thought of her father, of the unspoken expectation in his eyes. She thought of her squad, trusting her until the last. And then she saw it. Not with her eyes, but in her mind. A memory, not from a map, but from one of her father's old, grainy photographs. A picture of him and his unit standing before a massive Soviet-era communications relay tower, a monstrous lattice of steel that once bristled with antennas, stretching high into the sky. The tower was a relic, useless for decades. But it was tall. So very tall. Her eyes snapped open, scanning the darkness along the ridge. And there it was. A skeletal black giant silhouetted against the stars, perhaps half a mile away, rusted and forgotten. A crack in the wall. She turned to her squad, their faces hollow with exhaustion and defeat. "Jenkins," she whispered, her voice raw but firm. "The long-range antenna? The one we use for satellite backup. Does it have its own power source?" Jenkins, a communications specialist at his core, blinked. "Yes, Sarge, a small short-range battery." "But the jamming? It's too strong. A signal won't get through." "It will," Eva said, a wild, desperate hope igniting within her. "If the antenna is high enough. If it's above the local jamming field." She pointed to the monstrous dark shape of the old tower. "We're not calling from the ground. We're calling from the sky." The rusted ladder of the communications tower was a frozen, vertical nightmare. Each metal rung was slick with dew and corroded by decades of neglect. Sergeant Eva Rostova climbed, her every muscle screaming in protest. Jenkins followed just below her, the long-range antenna strapped to his back like an awkward metal cross. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze on the ridge, now whipped around them, trying to pry their frozen fingers from the steel. The higher they went, the more the tower swayed, a sickening, groaning pendulum against the vast, star-dusted sky. Below, the rest of the squad lay hidden among the rocks, their weapons trained on the enemy camp, their fate now literally in Eva's hands. She didn't look down. Her world was the next rung, the next breath, the burning in her arms. She focused on the memory of her father's face. Not the stern general, but the proud teacher, and on the 11 faces looking up at her from the darkness. She climbed for them. Finally, her hand touched the main platform. She hauled herself over the safety rail, Jenkins collapsing beside her, both of them gasping in the thin, biting air. The world spread out below them, a breathtaking tapestry of shadowy valleys and darker forests, the enemy campfire now just a tiny, insignificant orange pinprick. They were above the jamming field. They were above everything. "Now, Jenkins! Do it now!" Jenkins's hands, numb with cold, worked with a frantic professional speed. He assembled the antenna, connecting it to the rugged satellite radio. He extended the legs, planting it firmly on the rusted platform. His finger hovered over the power button. He looked at Eva, a final unspoken question in his eyes. If this didn't work, the power surge might be detected. They would be sitting ducks, trapped in a steel cage 100 feet in the air. Eva gave a single sharp nod. Jenkins pressed the button. A small green light on the radio blinked to life. It was the most beautiful thing Eva had ever seen. Eagle Actual, this is Badger 1, do you copy? Over." Jenkins's voice was a desperate prayer into the handset. For 3 heartbeats, there was only the hiss of pristine, unjammed static. Then a voice, clear and strong, crackled through the speaker. "Badger 1, this is Eagle Actual. We read you loud and clear. We've been hunting for your signal for 2 days. What is your status? Over." Jenkins nearly sobbed with relief. "Eagle Actual, we are 11 souls, 1 critical leg wound. We are at the old comms tower, grid Mike 7-2. Request immediate emergency extraction. Enemy forces are on the ridge. Over. Copy that, Badger 1. Hold your position. Cavalry is en route. ETA 15 minutes out." The wait was an eternity. Huddled on that freezing platform, they watched as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink. Then they heard it. The distant thumping rhythm of rotor blades. It grew from a whisper to a thunderous roar as 2 Black Hawk helicopters crested the far ridge, their running lights blazing like avenging angels. Searchlights stabbed down from the sky, sweeping the ridge, pinpointing the enemy camp. The enemy soldiers, caught completely by surprise, scattered into the trees, their own threat neutralized by the overwhelming force from above. One of the helicopters flared, its wheels hovering just feet above the rocky plateau where the squad had taken cover. Ropes were thrown down and strong hands reached out to pull the exhausted soldiers into the safe, warm belly of the bird. Ava and Jenkins scrambled down the ladder as the first helicopter lifted off. She was the last one to climb aboard the second bird, turning for one final look at the forest that had tried to claim them. Then the door was shut, and they were climbing, leaving the nightmare behind. A week later, on a clean, sun-drenched tarmac, Sergeant Eva Rostova stood at rigid attention. Her uniform was crisp, her boots polished to a mirror shine. Before her, a general with kind eyes pinned the silver star to her chest, speaking of courage, leadership, and unwavering resolve under fire. The cameras clicked. Senior officers shook her hand. But Ava's eyes were not on the general or the medals. They were fixed on the 11 men and women standing in the front row, their own uniforms clean, their wounds healing, their heads held high. Corporal Davis, leaning on a cane, gave her a small, solemn nod. Private Miller stood straighter than she had ever seen him. Jenkins offered a rare, genuine smile. As the formal ceremony concluded, the squad broke ranks and surrounded her. There were no grand speeches, no cheers, just a series of firm handshakes, a clasp on the shoulder, a look of profound, unbreakable respect. The official citation would talk of tactical brilliance and heroic actions. But her real victory, the only medal that truly mattered, was reflected in the eyes of every soldier she had brought home. They were safe. The mission was over. She had kept her promise,